Hi everybody, welcome back. Today our video is about contractarianism, also known as social contract theory. This is one of my favorite theories to discuss because we can see it in action in our current political practices and in our democracy. American democracy, to some extent, was built off of the ideas of some of the philosophers that we'll talk about today. Now, for the first part of this lecture, we're going to focus on the ideas behind modern social contract theory and Thomas Hobbes, because he is the father of modern social contract theory. When we go down to the second half of the board, we'll do a run-through chronologically from Socrates through Martha Nussbaum, talking about their different views of the social contract theory. So what is social contract theory? Social contract theory is a normative ethical theory that actually grew out of a political theory. So, in political philosophy, social contract theory is the view that says that governmental power is legitimate if and only if it would be accepted by free, equal, rational, self-interested people who are intent on selecting principles of cooperative living. As I said earlier, this is also a view in normative ethical theory that says that actions are morally right if and only if they are permitted by rules that free, equal, self-interested, and rational people would agree to live by, on the condition that others obey these rules as well. So, contractarianism originated as a political theory, and only later it developed into a theory of morality. It tells us that laws are just if and only if they reflect the terms of a social contract that free, equal, self-interested, rational people would accept as the basis of a cooperative life together. The view of morality stems directly from those political ideals. So actions are morally right just because they are permitted by the rules that those free, equal, self-interested, rational people would agree to live by. Something you need to keep in mind is that the rules apply the same to everyone. So you have rights, but you also have obligations and duties under social contract theory. If y'all take a look at the PowerPoint that I created for you that is posted on our class website, you'll see that it starts off with this word proceduralism. Now, this is something that was created by Russ Schaefer Landau in his book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. He talks about proceduralism. And he says, according to proceduralism, we should begin ethical theorizing by devising a procedure that will tell us the steps that we must take to distinguish right from wrong. And he says that one prominent proceduralist view is contractarianism, also known as social contract theory. Then he goes on and he gives his definition, and he says that contractarianism is the theory that actions are morally right because they are permitted by rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by, on the condition that others obey those rules as well. Let's talk about the background of modern social contract theory. So, one thing that you're going to hear about and read about, and there's an assignment posted on our class website for you that is about the prisoner's dilemma. And these are situations in which everyone would be better off if everyone scaled back their own self-interest in making the decision. And the situation that they put forward is usually a situation of two people engage in some sort of criminal conduct and they're caught, but the police don't have actual physical evidence against them, so they're looking for a confession. So the police separate the two suspects and they tell them, okay, this is the deal. If you confess and you tell us that the other person did this, if you essentially rat on the other person, then we're going to make sure that you don't serve any time. But if you don't confess, you're both going to serve time. So, y'all take a look at the link that's in the PowerPoint that I posted for you. There's a video there that you can watch. There's also some information posted on our class website about the prisoner's dilemma. And this is one way that prosecutors are actually able to get people to confess to things, and one way that they get into plea bargains is by leveraging people against each other. If both of the defendants stay silent and they don't say anything against each other, then they're more likely to end up with less time. But if one decides that they want to follow their own self-interest, then it can end up in a worse situation for the other. But if both of them decide that, then they're both going to get informed on, and they're both going to end up going away for a longer period of time. And when I say going away, I don't mean on a trip, I mean going to prison. So y'all take a look at that video that's posted and see what you think about that. See what you think you would do in that situation. Now, why does the prisoner's dilemma matter? This matters because this falls into the ideas behind social contracts. So part of the motivation for the prisoner's dilemma, or for social contract theory, comes from reflecting on prisoner's dilemma situations in which everyone would be better off if everyone could agree to scale back their own pursuit of self-interest. Now, Thomas Hobbes was the father of modern social contract theory. And according to Hobbes, life in a world without a government to enforce order would be a prisoner's dilemma situation at large. Now, Thomas Hobbes, one thing y'all need to know about him is that he lived during a very tumultuous time in English history. He was British, and he lived, specifically English, and he lived during the British Civil War, and he was on the side of the monarchy. So he saw all of this chaos that happened during the Commonwealth interregnum, which was a period of time after the Commonwealth beheaded Charles I and before Charles II was restored to the throne. And he had to move around with Charles II because he was his tutor. So he saw all of this chaos that came with war, and he thought that it was horrendous, and he saw the death and all of the suffering. And so what he decided was that it's better for us to have a government that has some kind of person in charge than for us to be in these chaotic situations. Now, Thomas Hobbes did not think that there is some inherent goodness or rightness in the world and in what we do, unlike other moral philosophers that we've talked about so far. According to Hobbes, moral philosophy is nothing else but the science of what is good and evil in the conversation and society of mankind. Good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which in different tempers, customs, and doctrines of men are different. So what Hobbes is saying is, he thought that we create morality, and that nothing is good or bad, nothing is moral or immoral until we decide that. Now, Hobbes is best known for his moral and political philosophy. Questions in political philosophy include those of why do we live under a rule of law? Why should we live under a rule of law? And Hobbes thought that in order to answer such questions, we need to go back to the root of what composes society. That's humans. And to do that, we need to examine humans in what he called the state of nature. So the state of nature is a thought experiment. It's not an actual situation in history. It's a thought experiment. And what it is a state of anarchy. There are no laws, there's no government, there's no society, there are no support structures, there's nothing like that. And what Hobbes thought was this sort of living, this kind of life, is actually a poor, nasty, brutish, and short life. And he thought that because there are 4 basic features of the human condition. He said these 4 basic features are the equality of need, so we all equally need things. There's a scarcity of resources. He said that there's an essential equality of human power. So maybe one person is bigger than another person and more physically powerful, but that other person, who's the smaller person, could go get another bigger person or more people on their side. And you just keep building up and building up on each side, but both sides are essentially equal. Hobbes also thought that there was limited altruism in the world, and this goes to his views of human nature. So Thomas Hobbes believed in the theory of psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is not a moral theory, it's a theory of human nature. And according to psychological egoism, humans are selfish and greedy, and we're competitive. So with that in mind, in a state of nature where there are no social goods, no farming, no industry, no education, no housing, no technology, because the social cooperation that is needed to produce those things doesn't exist, that sort of existence is one that would lead to us having short, brutal, nasty lives. So Hobbes thought that to imagine the state of nature, you need to imagine there's no government, there's no law enforcement, there's no organized social structure. And without all of these institutions that we take for granted and that we often complain about and that we often dislike, what is there that's left? If y'all take a look at slide 14 on the PowerPoint that's posted for you, you'll see that there's a short video about the state of nature that you can watch. Now, the state of nature is not a good place to be because, as I said previously, we can't do anything to advance human society or human civilization because we don't have social cooperation that's necessary there. And according to Hobbes, the only way to escape from such a situation is to agree to a social contract. A social contract is a set of rules that's created to promote cooperation and that set up an authority to punish violations of the contract. So in order to avoid that nasty, brutish, short life in the state of nature, there have to be guarantees that people will not harm one another, and people must be able to rely on one another to keep their agreements. Hobbes thought that only a government could provide for those two things. Therefore, we need a government. And he said that in establishing a government, people give up some of their personal freedom, the freedom of anarchy, and they give the government the authority to enforce laws, and enforce agreements. Those who live under a government are parties to a social contract. Each person agrees to follow the laws of the state on the condition that everyone else does the same thing. That way, we're all relatively safe from each other, and we all benefit from other social goods that result. According to social contract theory, the state exists to enforce the rules necessary for social living, while morality consists in the whole set of rules that facilitate social living. Thus, government is needed to enforce the basic rules of social living, so you don't rob people, don't break agreements, don't kill people, while morality may encompass some rules that are important for social living but are outside the scope of the state. So this includes, for example, don't insult people for no reason, things like that. All right. Let's go back, and let's get more into political philosophy for a minute. And let's take a look at this question of what is the source of power? So, for those of you who watch Game of Thrones, I told y'all I'd work some Game of Thrones into this stuff. There is a question that is asked by Varys. So Varys asks this riddle. He asked Tyrion, excuse me, sorry y'all, I'm having really bad allergies. He asked this riddle of Tyrion. It's about these three men and a swordsman, and he asks, where is power derived? You're going to have to watch Game of Thrones to see what he says, and to see what the riddle is. But what Varys ends up saying is that power is trick. It's an illusion. It's something that we see that's not really there, but that we create. So that's his view of it. Y'all watch Game of Thrones. I believe that is from season 2, when Tyrion is serving as the Hand of the King. All right. But let's go back and let's look at the history of power and the history of government throughout humankind insofar as we are aware. So first, there were the god kings, and these are like the pharaohs in ancient Egypt and the emperors in ancient Rome. These are the people who said that they themselves were gods, and that's why they got to have the authority of being the king. Next, there were the kings who claimed that they were the descendants of the gods, and these were like the Merovingian dynasty, who claimed that they were the descendants of the gods, and so that was the reason that they got to be the ones who were in charge. Next, this idea came up that the kings were the people who were chosen by God or the gods. And this is something that we call the divine right of kings. And this is something that many in English monarchical history, including and especially the Tudors, would argue made them all powerful because they were divinely chosen. Now, with social contract theory, especially with modern social contract theory, what we see is what we get to now. The idea that power is derived from the people. The people choose those who are going to be in power. And that's how we get democracy. Woohoo! All right, so this is one of the reasons why having the right to vote and having access to be able to vote are so important in democracy, or allegedly they are, is so that all of the people get to make their choice about who it is that's going to govern. So this means that you need the consent of the people, the consent of the governed, in order to be a valued governor. In order for you to have that place and to have it rightfully, you have to attain that position by the consent of those who are governed. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these other issues that are involved in the history of social contract theory. So we have them on the bottom half of the board in chronological order. First, we have Socrates. So if you take a look at the history of what happened with Socrates, Socrates was a brave warrior for the city-state of Athens, but he had no ambition after he finished fighting. He didn't want to go become a politician and amass power and amass goods. Instead, he taught people and he asked questions. He didn't charge anybody tuition for being his students, and he was pretty much like a weirdo to the people in Athens. He questioned the social order, he questioned the gods, he questioned everything. And for doing all of this questioning, he got in a lot of trouble. Socrates is one of our first examples of a wrongful conviction. Socrates was tried and convicted of heresy and corrupting the youth of Athens. Now, how was he corrupting the youth of Athens? He was teaching them to ask questions of their elders and of the people who were in power. So apparently that's corruption. I guess the same reasoning would say that I'm corrupting y'all. All right, so for those crimes, Socrates was sentenced to death. And the way that Socrates was supposed to die was he was supposed to drink this poison called hemlock. And it was a really painful, awful death, but that was the punishment. Now, there were some religious festivals going on between Socrates' trial and the date of his execution, and so according to Athenian law, he couldn't be executed till after those festivities had taken place. So before his execution, before he was supposed to commit suicide, Socrates was offered the opportunity to escape prison and save his life. Some of his students and his followers came to him and they said, "We're going to get you out of here, we're going to escape from Athens, nothing bad will happen, nobody will get hurt, come with us, let's go." And Socrates refused to do so. Rather than taking the opportunity to save his own life, Socrates refused to break his social contract that he had with the state of Athens. And in Plato's The Crito, Socrates gives a threefold argument that he should not break the law by escaping from prison. So first, Socrates says we are never to harm anyone. And he said that his escaping would harm the state because it would violate the law and it would show disregard for the state's laws. And he said, if I escape and I don't go through with my punishment, then I'm going to harm society. The next thing that he argued was that we should keep our promises. And he said, if one remains living in a state when you could leave it, when you have the option to leave, you are tacitly agreeing to obey the laws of the state. So even if you didn't vote for the people who are in power, even if you didn't vote for the laws that are in place, if you have the option and the opportunity of leaving, but you choose not to leave and you stay there and you take the benefits that come from living in that state, you're tacitly consenting to those laws. You're tacitly consenting to that government. And so Socrates said if he were to escape, he would be breaking an agreement, and that's something that you shouldn't do. So he said if he escapes, he would be breaking a promise, and we should keep our promises. And the last thing that he said was we should obey or respect our parents and our teachers. And he said one's society or one's state is virtually one's parent and teacher, and one ought to obey their parents and teachers. And if he is to escape, he would be disobeying his parent and teacher, which is the state. Now, whether or not you agree with him, that's up to you to decide. So, remember, Socrates taught Plato. Plato's the one who wrote the Crito. Then Plato taught Aristotle. So the way that Aristotle viewed the formation of the state is this. Aristotle believed that people naturally came together to form societies. He thought that we benefit from communal living, which gives us a security and a wider variety of goods than we could produce and gather alone. He also said that there are benefits from companionship. And for those reasons, he said, we're willing to exchange some of our freedoms for the greater benefits offered by living in a society and entering into a social contract. So, let me see. I have a quote here somewhere. Sorry, y'all. I have notes on a bunch of different pages that I'm working from. Okay, here we go. When several villages are united in a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the state comes into existence, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. And therefore, if the earlier forms of society are natural, i.e. the family and the village, so is the state, for it is the end of them. And the nature of a thing is its end. For what each thing is when fully developed, we call its nature, whether we are speaking of a man, a horse, or a family. And that was Aristotle's quote from Politics. Okay, so if we skip ahead, hundreds and hundreds of years, we get to Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century English philosopher, as I said earlier. He took a really dark view of humankind, and he felt that if we didn't live in societies, it would be everyone for him or herself, and that we would be perpetually fighting one another and doing nothing gainful. And he said that society is preferable because it means that we don't have to live looking over our shoulders for someone approaching essentially with a club to beat us over the head. We give up some of our natural rights in exchange for creating moral obligations and forming a social contract, but those obligations protect us. So Hobbes listed the laws of nature, saying that those can't really be called laws because there's no one to enforce them. He said that every person must be considered to have a right to all things, and that every person should be willing to give up that right if everyone else does the same. That the reason that people wish to join a commonwealth and choose to be ruled by another or by others is the foresight of their own preservation, that it would lead to a more contented life. And he considered that human desires are so varied that they're trying to build a society around trying to meet them would be impossible. So instead, he felt society could be built around avoiding the worst evil, which he saw as violent death. Now, after Thomas Hobbes, we have John Locke. Now, John Locke is considered to be like the midpoint between Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau was living in France. And Hobbes and Rousseau took completely opposite pictures of human nature. So Hobbes thought that human nature was this greedy, competitive, selfish thing, whereas Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that humans were by nature angelic and cooperative and that we were giving. But Rousseau thought that humans are born into this world in this kind of like angelic nature, but it is society that causes us to change and to essentially become worse people. So this is under this idea of being forced to be free. So the opposite to Hobbes' view is that humankind is more noble in the natural state than when living in society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that the natural human is a noble spirit, but that the constraints of society bring out the worst in us. He thought that by entering into a social contract, we're giving up our innate natural freedom, but we're exchanging it for a different kind of freedom. And he thought that all existing societies, now remember, he lived in the mid-18th century, so in the 1700s. This is before the American Revolution and the French Revolution. He said that all existing societies enslave people without offering the freedoms that we deserve. In a just society, laws are written and enforced for the greater benefit of all, and by choosing to live in a society and accepting the social contract, we are freed. He said, we are forced to be free, and we are forced to follow the laws that free us. So Rousseau denied that we have individual rights, such as property rights. He thought that in the properly constituted state, there should be no needed individual property rights, that everyone should share everything because everyone would benefit. Now, John Locke was another English philosopher, and he was there in like the middle ground between Hobbes and Rousseau. You also have the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the middle ground as well. And what they argued was that the social contract, and by extension society, must guarantee individuals the right to own and control property. So when people come together to form society, there's necessarily some sort of sovereign or leadership, and the power of the sovereign is limited by the rights of the individual people to own and control property. And they thought that if governments violate that principle, then people have the right to rise up and revolt, overthrowing the government so that the principles can be reinstated. According to John Locke, people might even have a duty to stage a revolution to form a society that gives them the correct sovereign and that reins in the power of the sovereign in accordance with the rights of the people to control property. So when you look at the history of like the Declaration of Independence and the founding American documents and different ideas around private property rights, you see that the right to revolt and the right to private property that John Locke talked about are things that were kind of some of the backbones of American society and the backbones of the way that American society was supposed to be set up under the Declaration of Independence and under those founding documents. Now, if you move farther down, you'll see some of our more modern philosophers, and one of those is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he talked about civil disobedience in reference to the social contract. And according to Dr. King, social contract theory provides a plausible account of when civil disobedience is justified. If you read his essay, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, you see that he provides justification for civil disobedience. And if y'all haven't read that, I highly suggest that you read it. You can also find on YouTube a recording that has him orating it, him reading it himself. And I think that it's really best understood and best appreciated if you read it while listening to him. It's really, really quite a feat of philosophy because Dr. King talks about a bunch of different types of philosophy that support his views. So in his famous essay in defense of nonviolent protests for securing civil rights for Black Americans in a self-governing society, he uses contractarian ideals to make his argument. Now, if you go further into our history in social contract theory, closer to what we have now, John Rawls, he was a philosopher who actually passed away not too long ago. I believe, 2002, I think, is when Rawls passed away. But John Rawls came up with this idea of what he called justice as fairness. And what Rawls was saying is, even though most societies are not in a position to create our government and create our society from the ground up, if we were going to do that, we should do it in a way that creates a just and fair society. And the way that we do this is all of us start out in what he called the original position. And when you're in the original position, you're behind what he calls the veil of ignorance. And so the idea is this: if we're all in the original position, none of us know where we're going to be in the society that is created. We could be someone who's really wealthy. We could be someone who's really economically disadvantaged. There's no way of knowing where you're going to end up in the society that we create. And so being behind this veil of ignorance being the thing that keeps us from knowing where we're going to be after we form the society, he thought that we would create a more just and a more fair society in that way. Last, we have Martha Nussbaum. She is my favorite philosopher, which all will know if you've been attending these lectures. And she talks about something called the capabilities approach. And this is an approach that was first originated by a philosopher named Amartya Sen. And what the capabilities approach is saying is, instead of us looking at the way that we live our lives and the way that we conduct ourselves according to what rights we have, we should consider what capabilities we have. Rights don't necessarily offer us the type of life that allows us to flourish. So according to this argument, there's this idea that if we look to what people are actually capable of, we'd be more likely to come up with a more fair way of living, a better way of living that considers capabilities. So one example of this is, like, you have the right to get a job, so there's that right. We have the right to work. We have the right to get a job. But are you capable of getting the job? Do you have a vehicle or some mode of transportation that's going to be able to get you to the job? In the past year, during the pandemic, we've seen that many people lost their jobs, not because of anything they did, not through any fault of their own, but because of outside influences, the outside influence of the coronavirus. So for those of you who were involved in the food service industry, you had the right to work, but you didn't have the capability of making money at your job because your job was shut down. So whenever we move on to feminist ethics, you'll see that I have some things posted about the capabilities approach, and I'd like to see what y'all think about that. Okay, we went over a lot of stuff today. The main thing that we need to remember is that when we're talking about social contract theory, we're talking about actions that are morally correct because they're permitted by rules that free, equal, rational, self-interested people would agree to live by on the condition that others obey those rules as well. There's one other thing that I want to point out before we go, and that is who is included in the moral community for social contract theory. Contractors. Those people who are engaged in this process of creating the rules, those people are the people who are part of the moral community. So you have to be free, equal, rational, self-interested. Now, when we talk about self-interest, the reason why self-interest is part of the key to this is because if you have a self-interest, in gaining something from society, then you are more likely to be part of that society. But remember that when we talk about the moral community, it's also going to include those who are part of the social contract through tacit consent. So if you're a part of that contract, if you're part of that society, and you choose to stay and to enjoy the benefits of that society, you are part of the moral community because you've chosen not to leave. Last thing I want to point out is that as much as I like social contract theory, and I do think that it is part of how we create our laws, how we run our democracy, there are some serious problems with it. Social contract theory originally only included certain white men. It did not include the majority of people in society and the majority of people who create our civilization and who are part of our civilization. It is seen as inherently sexist and inherently racist. In fact, I have a book called The Racial Contract and a book called The Sexual Contract that both go into a lot of detail as to the failings of social contract theory. So, like all of the theories that we talk about in this class, there are advantages to social contract theory and there are also disadvantages to it. Okay, everybody, thanks for hanging out today. I hope y'all have a great day, and I'll see you next time.